Happy Tuesday, DawgNation. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. I'm actually really looking forward to today's show. I think there's an interesting and I think fun topic. Now, we're going to do some fun stuff off the top of the George Pickens, but I kind of don't really even mean that. I mean, beyond that, I think there's a narrative that's kind of forming around Georgia right now that I actually think is pretty favorable. I'm talking about in terms of how it can be used, how it can maybe propel Georgia to be better on the side of the ball where Georgia really needs improvement for the upcoming season. I mean on offense. I'll try to make my case for that. Connor Riley also kind of wrote a little bit about this on DawgNation.com this morning. We'll talk to Connor about this later on in our program. There are a lot of things happening around the SEC. We'll try to follow the Zach Evans rumors at some point in time on today's show. So also some big talk from Dan Mullen. Boy, Mullen has got his He's excited about the upcoming season, so we'll let Coach Dan Mullen from the Florida Gators kind of weigh in on the proceedings here before we're done today as well. Just really glad to have you with us as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. It begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I think it's pretty safe to say that over the course of the last year or so, I've pretty well been the engineer of the George Pickens hype train. That's a label that I wear proudly. I have been very high on Mr. Pickens as a receiver, knew that was a player that Georgia really needed. He shows up at UGA. He has been, up to this point in time, at least on the field, very, very good. And so I feel validated by the fact that his freshman season worked out the way that it did. And as someone like me who is kind of always probably looking to turn up the knob on a little bit of hype here and there, the fact that Pickens now has published Heisman odds, well, I feel like my work in this case is done. I feel like that we have now kind of gotten Pickens into the national atmosphere, and his breakout performance in the Sugar Bowl has not gone unnoticed, and we around here, we feel pretty good about that. I mean, I was actually thinking before the show. Now, a wide receiver is not going to win the Heisman Trophy, whether it be George Pickens or anybody else. But I reckon if Georgia won the national championship and Pickens won the Heisman Trophy, I guess we'd just have to, stop doing the show. There'd be nothing left to talk about. That'd be the series finale. There'd be no topping that ever in the history of DawgNation Daily. So have no fear. I don't think that's quite going to happen. But nonetheless, nice to see Pickens getting some national love. What I'm referencing here for a moment is from Brett McMurphy, who works for Stadium and has a tendency to tweet a lot of odds coming out of Vegas, the Las Vegas Superbook, which for a long time, probably not quite as true as it used to be, but for a long time, the Vegas Superbook there has kind of been the market leader, the Westgate, in terms of various odds and things like that. They've got a new crop of a Heisman Trophy odds. There are actually 3 Georgia guys on here, and we'll get into more of the Jamie Newman part of this in a moment because that is probably the most, I guess, certainly in terms of where his odds are, pretty interesting. There are actually 3 Georgia guys on here. Can we show the Brett McMurphy tweet? Yeah, there's a little bit of that. You see Zamir White at 80-1. You see, as I said before, Jamie Newman, a part of a group there at 14-1. And George Pickens, the Georgia wide receiver, at 100-1. Now, we'll get to the Zamir thing maybe. We'll certainly do the Jamie Newman stuff in a moment. But let me talk about Pickens here just for a little bit as well, because I kind of know, what people are going to say. Well, it's great that Pickens has been noticed in terms of the Sugar Bowl. It's great that people are talking about that, but he's got to keep his head screwed on straight. He missed a half of the game against Georgia Tech, and then he missed a half of the game against the in the SEC championship against LSU. He's got to make sure he stays focused. He's got to make sure that he pays attention, and I understand all of that, and that's obviously true, and we'll let Pickens, in his own words, talk about that here coming up in just a minute. However, let me at least kind of throw this out there, that in the process of growing and maturing and becoming the guy you're supposed to be, which is really what college is about for everyone, I wouldn't be so afraid of a little extra national attention making that more difficult to do. If anything, I might make the case that suddenly being on the national radar, so much so even at 100-1, you get some Heisman Trophy odds, that might actually be kind of a good thing for George Pickens in terms of an extra motivator of exactly what he can achieve for himself by going out and maintaining his ability to do those things on the football field. By the way, if you're interested, he's actually in pretty good company when it comes to his current Heisman odds. For instance, Jamar Chase, according to Brett McMurphy's tweet, he's also only at 100-1. You get the two Alabama guys, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, they're both at 100-1. Terrace Marshall, the former five-star, he's also at a 100-1 as well. So most of this kind of related to the fact that we said before, wide receivers are not going to really win the Heisman Trophy, but in terms of where Pickens is viewed amongst some other kind of SEC names, they're all kind of right there in that same category. That's a really good thing to see. Now, let me give you another example of some national attention that Pickens is kind of getting as of late. Once again, we'll focus on the Jamie Newman stuff a little bit later on. I'm going to talk to Connor Riley about that a good bit here coming up in just a minute, but let me give you the Pickens part of this too. Alex Scarborough writing for ESPN.com. I love their way too early top 25. I love the little news nuggets and opinion pieces they do around this throughout the offseason. It's one of the things that kind of helps us pass the time as we get ready for the upcoming season. And recent story at ESPN.com, you actually may have even read some about this at DawgNation. Recent story was, here's how every one of the way too early top 25 can win the national championship this upcoming season. That's just kind of fun content. It's kind of a good thing to do during the offseason. But in particular on the subject of the Georgia Bulldogs, once again, Pickens' name comes up here as well. More national attention. Here's what Alex Scarborough says. I'm going to read this to you somewhat quickly. He writes that quarterback Jamie Newman needs to be a wake-up call for a far too conservative Bulldogs offense. Jake Fromm did all he could in his 3 seasons as the team's starting quarterback, but he couldn't change the plays that were called. Maybe Newman, a transfer from Wake Forest with true dual-threat ability, will force that change and finally bring this offense into the 21st century. Now listen, here's more from Alex Scarborough. He says, if that happens and George Pickens gets some help around him at receiver, then we know the defense is good enough to take it from there and carry this team back into playoff contention. Once again, that's Alex Scarborough from ESPN.com. Now, I think it's really interesting that while we, a show kind of focused on Georgia Bulldogs fans, kind of read what Scarborough writes here, he has to kind of write this for an audience that for the most part maybe only knows 1 or 2 names for each team. The audience for this story at ESPN.com is not necessarily the Georgia fan who can tell you all 85 guys on scholarship and a handful of the preferred walk-ons in addition to that. No, the market for this is someone living in New York City or Chicago or Houston or Dallas or L.A., someone like that who follows college football but may only know 2 or 3 names on various teams. And what the Scarborough piece does for you at ESPN.com is now gives you that indication that of the 2 or 3 names that the fairly plugged-in college football fan knows on each of the top teams in college football, George Pickens has now kind of become one of those guys. And if you think about that for a moment, it's actually kind of amazing to know that Pickens' emergence for Georgia happened in a year in which around him at wide receiver, I don't know if you've heard this or not, but things were not really great for the rest of the position group. But even in that environment, George Pickens still stood up. He still flourished. He still made quite a name for himself, which does, I think, speak to what he has a chance to do as a sophomore in 2020 as maybe more of a focal point of the Georgia offense. And then once again, you kind of circle back around to the idea of, yeah, but off-field concerns. And yeah, well, why wasn't he playing the first half against Georgia Tech? And yeah, why didn't he control his emotions better in the second half of that game? And then, caused him to miss part of the Sugar Bowl. And I should say the SEC championship. And yeah, but this and yeah, but that. I totally get all of that. I just wouldn't discount the role that this kind of attention, these kinds of expectations can play as in terms of kind of a motivating force to kind of go out and fulfill all that potential and actually become one of the true short list of household names in college football. In fact, let me let you hear a little bit of George Pickens on this, because while this has been a concern for UGA fans with the off-field situation, whatever it was, and really in some cases we haven't had full clarity on whatever that was, but with an off-field concern, lack of maturity, kind of keep Pickens from reaching everything that he has the potential to reach in a college uniform. Well, after the Sugar Bowl, when Pickens kind of had a breakout performance against the Baylor Bears, he talked about that and the way that he has grown and matured over the course of this season. Here's a little bit of what Pickens said then.
George, do you think that you've grown up over the last 4 months and even...
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
He still got growing to do.
Yeah, I still got growing to do, but I can kind of tell myself that I'm improving every day.
So listen, you hear Kirby Smart kind of step in there. He's still got some growing to do, and you hear Jake Fromm kind of step in, interject himself there as well to say, yes, he has grown. But there is something to be said for being more motivated to keep growing, being more motivated to keep maturing, when you know exactly what is at stake when you get a chance to do that. Pickens was also asked to kind of talk about what his first year in a college uniform was like. Once again, you'll hear a little bit of nervousness from Kirby Smart, but in terms of scripting an answer in an unscripted moment, because certainly Georgia didn't know that Pickens would be on the podium there that night, you couldn't have written a better answer than Pickens gave to the question of how would you describe that first year Georgia. Here is what Pickens said back on the first day of the 2020 calendar year. Here's Pickens again.
How would you describe this season, your first season in college football?
Careful, George.
I mean, it was a great season to me. I mean, you win some, you lose some, but I feel like every day, every practice, every walkthrough, we just fought. Like I like winning that way instead of winning the easy way out. I like fighting for the win.
I mean, who doesn't love that answer? I want to fight. I don't want it to be easy. I want to fight for everything, at practice, in games, and everything else. Kirby Smart tells him to be careful. I think that was carefully worded, and I think it was perfectly phrased by George Pickens. And all of a sudden now, with ESPN saying, hey, this is the wide receiver on Georgia that you know about, the Westgate saying, hey, here's a guy alongside a collection of LSU receivers and Alabama receivers, guys who've done some big things in a college uniform already. We're going to put Pickens in that group with posted Heisman odds. All of a sudden now, George Pickens, I think, has the chance to have a little bit more clarity of what it is that he's fighting for. A chance to be even more nationally known by the end of the 2020 season. Sometimes that kind of attention, sometimes that kind of hype can be its own motivating force that Pickens really can eventually make for himself a lot of money by becoming a big-time NFL receiver. And 2020 can be the next step when that happens. Obviously, we like Pickens. We're fans of his around here. And I think it's fun to see him getting that attention. And I think it will be very interesting to see how the next step of this all progresses. If it really does come together the way that it seems like it might for a receiver who made quite a name for himself in 2019. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Great to have you with us, no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. And as I said before, it's great to have Engineered Solutions of Georgia bringing it all to you. You know, they are a solutions-based company. That means when you got a problem like water creeping into your basement, you notice a damp spot in your crawl space, or it's one of those foundation issues, which can be a really serious thing. Those cracks in the foundation, they kind of let you know that you may have an issue. Well, Engineered Solutions of Georgia is the kind of company dedicated to providing a solution there for you for that problem. And one of the ways they do that is by having really smart people on their staff. 2 full-time engineers to help take care of you with any kind of waterproofing or foundation issue that you might be dealing with. And the great news is very easy to get in touch with. A really easy phone number to remember. Simply dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, coming up here in a moment, I'm going to get our buddy Connor Riley on the show. I thought he wrote something very interesting this morning about Jamie Newman, kind of touching on some of the stuff that we just addressed a moment ago, but also kind of taking it in a different direction. So before I bring on Connor, let me kind of spend a minute talking about that myself as we go around the doghouse here for just a bit. As I mentioned before, Westgate got the Heisman odds, and the Jamie Newman Heisman odds are at 14-1 right now. When you think about that, you think about just the sort of general excitement that Georgia fans have about their own quarterback, and that's going to be true no matter who the Georgia quarterback is going to be. It's one of those things of this is a very difficult position to be anonymous in, that the quarterback of the Georgia Bulldogs is legitimately one of the most famous people in the state of Georgia. Newman just got here. He'll pretty quickly find out just how true that really is, that you get lots of attention. Sometimes that's really, really fun. I think sometimes it can kind of veer in the direction of, hey, it'd be great to kind of go back to being unknown again, but quarterback at Georgia is just going to get a lot of attention. In this case, it's not just Georgia fans giving that attention. It's national media kind of giving that as well. And at 14-1, the, I believe, highest odds of any SEC quarterback, to a degree, that might seem too high. But let me ask you a question about this. When you look at the quarterbacks behind him in the SEC with their own odds coming from the Westgate, Miles Brennan, the, I guess for now, presumed starter at LSU at 25-1. I mean, doesn't it make sense, even though the LSU offense was so prolific? We've seen Newman start. We've seen him do well. Would you trade Miles Brennan for Jamie Newman? I certainly wouldn't. My guess is you probably wouldn't either. We've seen Mac Jones play. He played well in a bowl game, had a pretty good game in the Iron Bowl, although he did throw 2 pick sixes in that game. He's also a 25-1. Now, an Alabama fan may say, I'll take Mac Jones over Jamie Newman every day of the week. But I've talked to plenty of Georgia fans about Newman, and while it's not quite certain just how good Newman's going to be, I haven't heard that many suggest something along the lines of, we'll trade him for Mac Jones. I think Georgia fans are plenty happy with the Newman comparison when it comes to a guy like Mac Jones. Newman's Heisman odds being better than Jones, even if I don't necessarily know that Newman's necessarily a Heisman contender, better odds than Jones certainly makes sense. I'll say the same thing about Bo Nix at Auburn, who's also a 25-1. Kyle Trask at Florida, who's 60-1. I'm going to tell you this right now. I'm not trading Jamie Newman for Kyle Trask if I could, if college football enabled trades. I'm not trading Newman for Trask. I'm not trading Newman for Bo Nix, even though I think that by the end of the season, Nix had actually become kind of a better quarterback. I'm still not making that trade for Jamie Newman. In other words, I don't quite know as of yet how good Newman's going to be, but I feel pretty confident saying that he fits into an SEC this year where there is a lot of uncertainty for a lot of teams at quarterback. The post-Joe Burrow era at LSU, the post-Tua Tagovailoa era at Alabama, really not all that much different than the post-Jake Fromm era here at UGA. There's a lot of kind of unrest and unsettled situations when it involves quarterbacks. And, various teams are going to make a case for their guy, but in terms of the overall arguments in favor of so-and-so having a good season, in that particular case, I really don't know that Jamie Newman takes much of a backseat to anyone. So a little surprising maybe to see his Heisman odds as high as they were, 14-1, according to the Westgate, as Brett McMurphy tweeted yesterday. Still maybe kind of a long shot to actually win the award, and the actual odds may be a little bit different than that. But in terms of being above some of these other SEC quarterbacks in that packing order, that part of this at least makes a good bit of sense to me. It is DawgNation Daily. We're presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Speaking of Kyle Trask, the Florida Gators, Dan Mullen has said something I think kind of funny. We'll deal with it a little bit of that later on in the show. But I also want to talk more about the situation around Newman and a narrative that's forming around Georgia that I think is actually pretty positive. So let's kind of move on with that. Let's talk to our buddy Connor Riley here right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
He writes Good Day UGA every morning for DawgNation.com, and he's good enough to join us here on DawgNation Daily right now. It is our buddy, Connor Riley. And Connor, I was talking about Jamie Newman before you joined us. Let me kind of continue that because I know you wrote about him for your Good Day UGA piece this morning. 14-1 to win the Heisman Trophy. Getting the kind of hype that you would typically expect any Georgia quarterback to kind of get, and yet for Newman right now, is that too much?
Yeah. You look at some of those odds, you see a guy like Sam Ehlinger, 14-1, Ian Book, 20-1, I believe. A guy like Najee Harris, 40-1, who I think is going to have a really big year for Alabama next year. As exciting as the potential of Newman might be, he still completed less than 50% of his passes in 4 out of the last 5 games last year. And I still do have a lot of questions about him and how he's sort of going to adjust to a completely new offense, because we just saw this past year with Jake Fromm, a new offense does not necessarily make you a better football player.
Which is certainly true. So here's the case that I'll make. I really have no interest in comparing him to an Ehlinger or, guys I know have better odds than him, like, say, Spencer Rattler, Justin Fields, things like that. I'm not interested in making that comparison right now. But given some of the names I mentioned before you joined us here today, if college football enabled trades, I'm not trading Jamie Newman for Kyle Trask. Now, I don't know that Newman's a better player than Trask, but I'll take my bet on Newman there in that regard. I feel the same way about, Miles Brennan. I feel the same way about Mac Jones, who may be the most controversial take on that, because Jones has actually played, a little bit for Alabama and kind of played well doing it. But I'm not trading Newman for Jones. I'm not trading Newman for Bo Nix. In other words, I don't quite know how good Jamie Newman is going to be. But in an unknown year for most of the top SEC teams when it comes to quarterback, or at least the very top teams, Alabama, LSU included, in a year of kind of unknowns at the quarterback position, I'm kind of fine with Georgia's version of the unknown on that. I'm not going to tell you that Newman has a great year, not even going to predict him to have an all-SEC year. But knowing that there's lots of unanswered questions for SEC teams at quarterback, Georgia's version of those unanswered questions, I think, are actually fairly appealing to me.
I just disagree. I think I would take Trask. I think I know what Trask is. I thought he was a good quarterback last year for Florida once he actually got some consistent playing time. And the fact that he's at 60-1, I see a very easy case where, let's say Florida somehow does beat Georgia and they get to the SEC championship game, they somehow win that game. An 11-1, 12-1, I guess, Florida team making the playoffs. Trask would have a very easy case, in my opinion, as a Heisman winner, largely just because of the narrative surrounding him. And that's why I think Newman's odds are what they are. Not so much because it's necessarily believed that he is the fourth best player in college football, but because if Georgia makes a college football playoff, he's going to have a very compelling narrative to people as the sort of trigger man who turned everything around for the Bulldogs.
Plus, generally speaking, in college football, positions are more predictive than people. In other words, the Georgia quarterback has a certain threshold of achievement that Newman's likely to achieve. And I know last year was not a great year for the Georgia quarterback position, but over the course of the last 5 years, if you don't even stretch it longer than that, there's a certain threshold of achievement that the Georgia quarterback position has achieved. And if Newman's the guy that's occupying that spot, I think the better overall, predictor for what his success is going to be is what previous Georgia quarterbacks have looked like, maybe more so than what he previously did at Wake Forest, because he's been tabbed to be the Georgia quarterback.
To an extent, yeah, that's why I think it makes sense that you see Spencer Rattler at 12-1, given the success Oklahoma quarterbacks have had.
That's a bet on Sooners quarterbacks right there.
Than necessarily a bet on Spencer Rattler. But again, it's a new offense. He has not worked with Todd Monken before. He has not really worked with any of these players before. And again, I know we're all expecting him to be the starting quarterback. I certainly am, but he has not been named the starter yet. He has not taken a single practice snap yet with Georgia, nor a competitive snap with them either.
So that's certainly fair enough. And yet the real reason I wanted to, I think, get into this conversation, have you on, is I think there's a deeper part of this that you and I seem to see a little bit differently. Am I characterizing your opinion fairly if I say that you're concerned there's too much hype building around Jamie Newman?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that's really interesting. I actually think the national conversation is better than that. Let me go back to the Alex Scarborough thing, which I know you've written about at DawgNation.com, and folks can also read for themselves at ESPN.com. As a Georgia fan, as someone who wants the best for Georgia, I don't think I could ask a national writer to say something better than this. I think this is exactly the narrative that I want forming around Georgia. I'll read it again, just a couple sentences. Scarborough writes that Jamie Newman needs to be a wake-up call for a far too conservative Bulldogs offense. Jake Fromm did all he could do in his 3 seasons as the team's starting quarterback, but he couldn't change the plays that were called. Those 2 sentences right there, to me, I wish I could put that on a billboard. I wish I could just get that into the atmosphere as much as possible, because what I see there, to the extent that one writer at ESPN.com is helping cast a narrative, what I see there is not pressure on Jamie Newman to come in and be a savior. I see pressure being put on the Georgia play-calling philosophy to finally evolve and get with the times. I say this to the point of a broken record. I am always going to put extra pressure on the coaches, less pressure on the players. It's the coaches who make the millions of dollars. And from that standpoint, what Scarborough writes here is it was the Georgia coaches who failed last year because they didn't give Jake Fromm a winning game plan, and it's the Georgia coaches this year who need to get the most out of Jamie Newman. I actually take those sentences as extra pressure on coaches as opposed to extra pressure on Jamie Newman. And from where I'm sitting, Connor, I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, I definitely think if I had to say who was, I think, under more pressure this year, I would put it under Todd Monken than necessarily Jamie Newman. Monken is a guy who comes from an NFL level and certainly for a time looked like he was on an upward trajectory in terms of, potentially being a head coach somewhere. And, this is I would say there's a certain amount of risk here because we just saw with James Coley, this time last year, I think if you'd said James Coley would have been one and done at Georgia, you would have assumed, oh, well, Georgia, had a very successful season, made a college football playoff, possibly a national title, and somebody, because of his recruiting background and what he was able to do with the Bulldogs this year, turned him into a head coach. That just flat out wasn't the case, and there's a reason now he is taking a step back and going to be the tight ends coach at Texas A&M. So I would certainly agree with you that there's a substantial more amount of pressure on Todd Monken and whoever that quarterback's coach most likely ends up being than necessarily Newman.
I mean, you and I have kind of gone round and round about this off the air. I do this with our buddy Chuck Smith on our Falcon show from time to time there as well. if you look at what LSU did this past season, now listen, I'm going to be very careful to say that LSU's gigantic transformation on offense is not necessarily a template for Georgia because it's not that easy to replicate what LSU did a year ago. But if we just kind of use that as a guide for a moment, if you had to ask me who was more responsible for that huge change, is it Joe Brady? Is it Joe Burrow? I'm going to say Joe Brady over and over again because we saw most of these same players in 2018 be a good, not great offense, and yet the presence of Brady kind of changed everything. With that same idea in mind, Connor, in 2020 in college football, I think it's far more difficult to find an elite offensive play caller than it is to find an elite quarterback. I think there are lots of quarterbacks that in the right system can have actually really good numbers, and yet the kind of coaches who are capable of being the architect of one of those kinds of systems, that list is just not very long right now.
I disagree with you on the Brady Burrow thing because Brady wasn't the one running away from Trayvon Walker, Monty Rice, Lewis Cine, and chucking the ball 40 yards downfield into tight windows. I think Burrow was truly a special elite talent, and he's on the short list, in my opinion, of the best players of the 21st century. So, as great as Brady was to an extent, I think Burrow made a lot of things in that offense really click. And at the end of the day, for as much as we hype up Monken's only going to look as good as Jamie Newman is allowed to make him look, I think.
I think that's true, but I don't want to get too lost in the weeds on this, but you mentioned the Burrow ability to make a Trayvon Walker miss and some of the things that he did with his legs. Would you not acknowledge, though, that is made easier by an offensive system, and I love the phrase that Brady's used on this, that made you to defend every blade of grass in the field, or in the case of Mercedes-Benz Stadium, the field turf. When you have to defend the full width, the full length, isn't it easier to do some of the things athletically that we saw Joe Burrow do, which is also potentially kind of a nice thing to think about for a guy in Newman who's also a pretty athletic quarterback, that when an offense is really putting pressure on you in every direction, suddenly quarterbacks just find more room to run?
No, I don't think it's easy to run away from Trayvon Walker and Lewis Cine, and especially the way he ran away from them. I get what you're saying, and to a large extent, you're correct. But at the end of the day, running what he was able to do, especially in that Georgia game where we all saw, I think that was truly a special player there.
So with all of this in mind, let me kind of spin this forward another direction as well. Georgia now has a coaching opening. As you mentioned, James Coley is gone. When I think about the best of the Georgia offense this season, when I think about what Scarborough writes here at ESPN.com about, putting pressure on Georgia to, not be as conservative as it was a year ago, I think the only right move to make here is giving Buster Faulkner the promotion that I think he deserved anyway. I want to throw as much resource as I can, as much human capital as possible towards making this offense just more dynamic than it was last year. There's really no one who I want to see be the 10th assistant coach more than Buster Faulkner, who at least currently is listed as an analyst. How do you feel about that? How do you think Georgia fans should feel about that?
So this point was made, I believe, by Jake Rowe of 247 Sports, but don't you think, with Coley reportedly, that has not been officially announced yet, but with him heading to Texas A&M, don't you think Georgia would have already gone ahead and announced Faulkner as sort of that step-in replacement if he was that guy?
So I can't speak to what Georgia's eventually going to do. That certainly makes some sense. I can't speak to that. The only thing I can say is if I was Kirby Smart and if I was in this spot, I think a guy like Buster Faulkner, if you look at some of his numbers, has actually been a pretty successful offensive coordinator at the Group of Five level. When you look at the way that some of the draft folks are kind of evaluating Jake Fromm and the fact that maybe over the course of his junior season, some of his technique kind of faltered a little bit. Some of his mechanics may have waned a bit. Throwing a person who seems to have some expertise in that at that position in the situation to be paired with Todd Monken, get that extra value that goes from being an off-field analyst to an on-field coach, that's the move that I would make. Will Georgia eventually make a different decision than that? They very well might, but that's the decision that I would make.
Yeah, and to that point, I think Kirby has done a pretty strong job of replacing assistants. Nobody knew who Dan Lanning was before he took over for Kevin Scher, and Scher is now going to be a linebackers coach for the New York Giants, and we were talking off the air yesterday. I think we'd all agree you'd rather have Lanning right now than Scher. I think Charlton Warren, with the work he did in this defensive back class, he's been a pretty good replacement for Mel Tucker so far. So I do think when Kirby has been asked to find replacements for his guys, with I think the exception being James Coley replacing Jim Chaney, he's done a pretty good job of identifying and making the right hire that his team sort of needs based on the ebbs and flows of each season.
Kind of one more topic on this subject. I think it's interesting to also see Zamir White's name on this list of Westgate Heisman odds at 80-1. I talked a good bit about this last week. I'm sure I'll end up talking a lot about this a lot in the future, about how Georgia's reputation as RBU, its ability to kind of get the most out of running backs like Zamir White, might potentially change as it, at least in my mind, seems to be sort of stepping the direction of becoming a little bit more efficient throwing the football. There's no free lunch in college football. Getting better at one thing puts you at risk in another direction. There's at least some risk that Georgia will be less successful running the ball. Ultimately, though, I'm not that worried about that. Todd Monken's track record in a lot of cases kind of showed him, having some success running the football. I don't quite know what the ratio of all this is going to look like, but ultimately I still think there's a place for good running backs in a Todd Monken offense for as long as he happens to be here. How do you feel like the role for guys like White and Kendall Milton and James Cook and Kenny McIntosh is going to evolve with what we think is going to be a pretty substantially different UGA offense in 2020?
Yeah, as far as White, basically his entire prep, since he was probably a sophomore in high school, he's been used to, hearing about these expectations that other people have put on him. And this is probably the first time that he's going to be totally healthy and have a chance to really live up to those. Because I think even there were times last year we saw he was still, regaining a mental comfort in what he was able to do with that knee. And as far as Monken, Nick Chubb this last year finished second in the NFL in rushing.
Yeah.
Joseph Randall, going back to his time as the Oklahoma State offensive coordinator back in the early decade, had, I believe, 2,600 yards and 38 touchdowns over the course of 2 seasons.
Yeah.
And to your point about, defending every blade of grass, that is sort of what Monken's offense is, in theory, supposed to be able to do. And with Georgia theoretically stretching the field more, that's going to pull those safeties out of the box, which should make things a little bit easier for guys like Zamir White and Kendall Milton.
I mean, to me, I think it's as simple almost as saying that if you look at the Todd Monken track record, when he has had a running back that could be used, he's chosen to use him. Look at as a head coach at Southern Mississippi, for instance. When Ito Smith emerged as a player, they gave him plenty of carries. In 2013, when I guess Smith was on the roster or whatever else, they didn't have very many rushing yards at all. You can almost say the same thing about, Tampa in 2018. But some of that kind of comes down to the running backs you had to be used. But when you have a Randall, when you have a Nick Chubb, when you have an Ito Smith, Todd Monken has shown that his offense still makes room to use guys like that.
Yeah, his last year at Southern Miss, he had 2,000-yard rushers in that same backfield. And obviously, both those guys ended up being NFL players. But we all sort of think that if you're a running back coming to Georgia, Georgia's always got 1 or 2 running backs that are going to be doing something in the NFL. So you would think, whether that be Zamir White, Kenny McIntosh, Kendall Milton, James Cook, the 5th running back I think they eventually bring in, they're going to get something out of them.
Yeah, no, it should be very interesting. Connor, good stuff. Thanks for being here. We'll look forward to reading a lot more from you at DawgNation.com.
Yep, thanks, BA.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I think it's really good stuff. And obviously these names, Monken and Newman and, all these guys are going to be a big part of the offseason conversation. But just kind of sum up what we were saying before, the thing that, and I say this as a partisan here for a moment, someone who wants the best for Georgia. The thing that makes me pleased right now, at least on the basis that, some of the stuff that you're written kind of is reflective of larger views, is it seems to me the pressure's actually being put where it's supposed to be, on the coaches to get the most out of players. I think the Georgia coaches in a lot of ways failed Jake Fromm a year ago. I think they could have given him a better game plan. I think they could have given him more to work with. I think they didn't do right by him in some regards, given the offensive game plan that he was allowed to work with. And I don't know how good Jamie Newman's going to be at Georgia, but I think he has the raw materials. I think he has the natural talent with his legs, with his arm, everything else, that you ought to be able to get something out of him. And it's the job of the Georgia coaches to design an offense around him that works. And so it may make you a little anxious to see, so much national hype for Newman, so much, of that. A lot of that's just a byproduct of where he's playing. This is a program that just sort of harvests hype in a large measure. But for me, the actual pressure that goes along with that hype, at least for now, is resting where it's supposed to be, on the millionaire coaches to get the most out of these kinds of players. Hey, let's go cruise around the SEC for a moment, courtesy of our friends at Royal Caribbean. And One of my favorite things about a Royal Caribbean vacation, and one of the things that I think that you will love if you've never experienced it before, is what they call Perfect Day Coco Cay. It's an island oasis, private only for Royal Caribbean vacationers, and it's an amazing, amazing experience. It's not a one-size-fits-all type thing. There's a chill side, there's a thrill side. So on the one side, you've got like Up and Away, which is a helium balloon that's 450 feet in the air. But you've also got like Oasis Lagoon, which is the largest freshwater pool. All kinds of coves, kind of hide away and spend some time with family, share some cocktails, so you can relax. You can be, enjoying like a zip line, just all kinds of stuff. And it's only available on a Royal Caribbean cruise. So do me a favor. Contact your travel advisor or reach out to my friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority at 800-326-4971. 800-326-4971. That'll get you in touch with the Cruise and Vacation Authority and tell them you heard about them right here on DawgNation Daily. All right, so it is now official, or at least it's on its way to be. Bo Pelini is going to be the LSU defensive coordinator. A blast from the past, returning back to Baton Rouge. And, certainly LSU is on its way to making a case to be the SEC's most interesting team. You've already got Orgeron, who's like this larger-than-life personality. Pelini's also been that as well. And this will be a very quotable, very noticeable, very kind of high-profile deal at a time in which the big-name coordinator is seemingly less in vogue than it kind of used to be around the SEC. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that you had, like, say, Kirby Smart still a DC at Alabama, and Jeremy Pruitt was at Georgia, and you had these kind of, like, really well-known, kind of famous coordinators. But there's less of that around the SEC than there used to be. Like, Kevin Steele makes like $2.5 million at Auburn, but Steele doesn't have one of these really big personalities. He's not super recognizable if you see him on the sideline. For the most part, Georgia and Alabama both have kind of young, up-and-coming defensive coordinators, which SEC fans know about Golding and Lanning, but the average college football fan doesn't recognize those defensive coordinators the way that top lieutenants would have been in the past. But Pelini, because he has been Nebraska head coach, because he has been, I guess, kind of semi-controversial figure in some respects, because he had the faux Pelini account kind of, mocking him all the time, Pelini is kind of bringing back an era in which that sort of top lieutenant assistant is going to be pretty well known again. And we'll see how this works out for LSU. He's obviously got big shoes to fill. I think Dave Aranda was a good defensive coordinator. You think of LSU as more of an offensive team this past season, but Aranda was a sharp defensive mind, one of the reasons why he became a head coach. So former five-star wide receiver, most recently at Penn State, Justin Shorter, has announced his plans to transfer to Florida. And I'm a Gator hater. I don't like beating up on the Gators. But in this particular instance, I'm going to have to give credit where credit's due. One of the things that Florida has proven to be good at is managing the transfer market. They have found some transfer players. Van Jefferson's an example of a transfer receiver they brought in. The Gators have been pretty good about this. Now, Shorter, in his time at College Station, did not necessarily live up to the five-star hype. He didn't have a lot of stats associated with his name. Maybe it's because every so often one of these five-star guys ends up not being all that good. Maybe it was something about the situation in Penn State there in particular. But transfer players are valuable. I celebrate it when Georgia gets one. I notice when other programs get one. You're bringing in someone who had the initial talent to be highly regarded coming out of high school, but now a little bit more age, a little bit more maturity, and sometimes a little bit better physical conditioning after having been in a college program. I think over the course of the long haul, for a program like Florida to say we're going to make up the gap between Georgia's recruiting advantage over us by taking transfer players, over the long haul, you can't do that every single time. You're going to eventually, create an additional deficit. But for Florida, who admittedly can't keep pace with UGA in recruiting, you do have somewhat of an ability to kind of match that from time to time by working the transfer market. And to Florida's credit, they have done a pretty good job of this in the past. So we'll see how Shorter works out there. But interesting news for the Florida Gators. Then finally, there's this. Georgia's pitch to five-star running back Zach Evans has been a chance to play for a running backs coach in Del McGee, who's gotten guys like Sony Michel, Nick Chubb, soon to be DeAndre Swift in the NFL, a chance to be a part of one of the nation's top public universities. By comparison, Tennessee's pitch to Evans would appear to be vandalism, because the latest salvo in the recruiting war for the five-star running back involves the famous rock that is on the Tennessee campus, I guess painted in support of Zach Evans. If you're watching on video, I'll let you get a chance to see this. So this is the rock, and it says Zach Evans 2020, and there's a little Vol for Life tag there on that. Evans did take his visit to Knoxville this past weekend. I have no idea where Evans is going this upcoming weekend. I don't know if this is something that Georgia's really going to be back involved in. Different kinds of online chatter would lead you to believe different things. But Tennessee's big pitch here would appear to be painting up the rock in honor of Evans. I guess Evans did notice this and mention this on his Instagram story, but nonetheless, Tennessee had its chance to make its pitch to Evans, and we'll kind of find out what the next twist and turn in this little rumor mill is. But for now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of our friends at Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, let me come back to the Florida Gators here just for a moment, because Dan Mullen did on the weekend what a lot of coaches do. They find a time to grab a microphone, speak at halftime of a college basketball game, and Mullen was there to kind of fire up the crowd and thank them, but also provide a little big talk that did not go unnoticed by our buddy Eddie here on the desk and the rest of the Gator Hater crew as a part of DawgNation Daily. Let me let you hear a little bit of Dan Mullen with some big promises about what's still yet to come for the Florida Gators. Here is the Gators coach.
The unbelievable atmosphere and the home field advantage you created for us down at the Orange Bowl down in Miami to get another great win. And I promise you this, that's just the beginning. We finished the top 10 in the last 2 years. And that's the beginning. We came back to I came here to bring the Gator standard back, which is a team that's going to compete for and win SEC national championships all the time. And that's what we're going to be.
So I'm going to give you two opinions on this. One that will be completely unsurprising, and one that might be just a little bit surprising. Here's the unsurprising part. This is exactly what you expect me to say. I don't believe a word of what Dan Mullen's saying there. I don't believe that the best is yet to come from Florida. In fact, I think Florida's best chance at toppling Georgia in the SEC East, a school, by the way, he does not mention in that little missive there. I think Georgia's best chance of ceding the East over to Florida may have actually been this past season, when Georgia was, I think, objectively speaking, fairly broken on offense. But even in a year like that, Florida still could not topple Georgia, still couldn't get over that mark. I think in 2020 it may actually get more difficult for Florida, because I think that Georgia is about to kind of get with the times and usher in a bit more of a modern offense. So the idea of back-to-back top 10 seasons and the best is yet to come, the second part of that, I just don't think is true. And I think the Florida fans who seem to be still very happy with Mullen for right now may eventually be the ones that turn on him once they realize they've been sold a bill of goods, and that you can't beat Georgia on the field if you're not beating Georgia regularly in the recruiting rankings. And Florida's just not really doing that. There are a lot of SEC teams that are far more of a thorn in Georgia's side from a recruiting standpoint than Florida is. So we've never really bought Mullen when it comes to things like this. However, here's the part of this that may be somewhat surprising. The fact that Mullen takes a microphone like this, the fact that, he talks up his fan base, the fact that for now that fan base is still very much believing what Mullen is saying, I do think in a roundabout way that is a good thing for Georgia. I think rivals just have a way of pushing you to be your best. I think that Georgia was pushed over the course of this offseason to make a bold move like bringing in Todd Monken, to view a guy like James Coley as expendable even though he had value to the program, to go out and try something different at quarterback given the fact that Fromm's departure left a void there. I think all of that pressure to do all of that in some form or fashion may have been brought about by the fact that Florida, at least to its credit, has been in the top 10 these last couple of years, and programs like Auburn show no signs of going away. Georgia has to play Alabama coming up in September. Sometimes the presence of a rival can be a good thing. It motivates you to be your best. And during this offseason, it certainly seems like that Georgia is taking that step to make sure it is at its best so they can prove Dan Mullen wrong come October. So, listen, we're Gator haters. We have a good time with that. It's fun to be able to do that with you. I'll also mention Georgia basketball tonight in Columbia, Missouri against Missouri. This has not been a good run for the Dogs in basketball as of late. We'll see if they have a better performance tonight on the road there in the SEC after a pretty ugly one this past Saturday against Ole Miss. But nonetheless, happier times, though, as I mentioned before, when it comes to those lousy, stinking Gators. The fact that it's been quite some time since Florida's beaten Georgia, and we think still going to be a long time to come before the Gators have anything to brag about when it comes to the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. In fact, 1,186 days. That's how long it's been since the lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs, and that is good news for us. So thanks for being with us here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. It is a fun offseason for the Dogs. Getting ready for a big run in 2020. We're happy to be talking about it with you, and we'll see you again tomorrow. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. And I'll remind you, it was like 30-something degrees this morning when I was driving in. That means you need to make sure your heating system is ready to go for the winter to come. You need the R.S. Andrews Mega Furnace Safety Check, not only to make sure that it's working the way that it's supposed to, but make sure, as I said before, that it's safe for you and your family. So it's just $99, and you can find out more about that online at rsandrews.com. All right, we'll do Facebook first today, and then we'll pop over to YouTube here in a minute. So give me just a second to pull these up. And we got time. We'll do, I know we were a little shorter yesterday, so why don't we do 15 minutes today? We'll get off the air just shortly after 11 a.m. That'll give me time to do what I need to do and give you time to get a chance to weigh in. So we'll kind of do all of that. Bob Garrison says Mullen gets to eat his words again in 2020. And yeah, this is what college football is all about, right? Programs talk big. The coaches want to talk big because they're trying to sell people. They're trying to sell students on being in attendance. They're trying to sell boosters on opening the wallet, trying to sell players on coming to the program. There's a huge motivation to kind of have big talk and talk about what you're going to do. There's an incredible motivation to do that. And so it's what makes it really fun when you get a chance to play these rivalry games, because by the time you get there, October 31st, the date for this year's Georgia-Florida game, by the time you get there, there's been a lot said on both sides and a lot to back up, a lot to be proven right or wrong about. It's what makes the SEC great. And in Florida's case, the fact that they're attempting to nip at Georgia's heels, even if I don't believe they're ever going to get there, the fact that they're attempting to do that, I think helps motivate Georgia to go where it needs to go. Graham Nicholson says, what about Jaden Hazelwood? Yeah, I think that seeing how Hazelwood works in that Spencer Rattler Oklahoma offense to come, I think that might be a good thing to be able to see. I know that people kind of made a lot of note of the fact that, maybe was not as good of a freshman season for Hazelwood as he expected. That was an Oklahoma team that was deep at receiver, and they were obviously pretty prolific throwing the football. So in terms of how happy or how much of a home Hazelwood's going to find in Norman with the Sooners, let's see what a sophomore year looks like for him before we make any kind of evaluations on that. Dustin McKinley says that he hears Auburn insiders saying that they believe that Broderick Jones is flipping. All I can tell you on this, Dustin, is I've asked Jeff this question 97 different ways. Every time he's on the program, we kind of ask him that, talk about that. We kind of go at that because it's obviously one of the big remaining issues left for Georgia. And Jeff has been unwavering in his belief that he believes that that Jones is UGA bound. So you really can't do much more than that than what we've done. We've been very direct with Jeff about that, and to his credit, he's been pretty direct with us back as well. James Crump says, why are we still pursuing Corey Foreman? Doubt he flips from Clemson. Yeah, historically speaking, the Clemson guys just don't really flip very much. So, yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. Jeremy Chapman says, he agrees with me that Jamie Newman can at least do enough with his legs that the offense doesn't take a step back. And I would also follow that, Jeremy. Ultimately, I believe this is Todd Monken's offense that Jamie Newman's going to be a part of. To me, this is not one of those situations where Newman comes in needing to be the savior. Georgia's need for a savior is in the coaching room, not the quarterback room. Because I think that Georgia had a capable quarterback these last 3 years. At times, they didn't get as much out of him as they should have. So the need for a savior rests in the coaching room more so, I believe, than on the field at the quarterback position. So I think that Newman brings a lot to the table, but in terms of how good he ends up being, this isn't about finding out how good he truly is. I think the bigger question is, how well can UGA use him? Robert Hosea says, didn't Jones just tweet 100% committed? Yes, he did. What he said was he was still committed, but he does have that visit to Auburn coming up. But as I said before, Jeff has been unwavering in his belief that he is still coming to UGA. Matt Rugavina asked about Weston Wallace, the three-star I guess, preferred walk-on that Georgia just added. I know a lot of folks really like him a lot. Admittedly, I don't know a ton about him, but I know a lot of folks really like him. There's a good bit of online chatter. I guess there was maybe some belief that Kirby Smart's Go Dogs tweet from yesterday may have been in reference to Wallace. So, yeah, I think a lot will I think there's a lot of folks who think he brings something to the table. James Crump also on the subject of Cedric Van Pran, who I think also is kind of thought to be all dog here for a moment, despite the fact that I think he also has a visit coming up this weekend. Let me get some YouTube comments here just for a moment. We'll do about 7 more minutes or so. Richard Stovall asking about Wallace. Yes, he is a preferred walk-on right now, yes. Robert Clark says Mullen's the real Rich 2.0. Nice but not great recruiting classes, 10-win seasons, maybe has a good year, and pulls out an SEC East championship, but no sustained excellence. Not part of the college football elite. Yeah, I believe that. For whatever reason, the media's kind of always liked Mullen for various reasons. Media likes coaches that do more with less, and admittedly, and you can kind of see in the aftermath, like I say, the Joe Moorhead era at Mississippi State, and maybe what's about to happen with Mike Leach, that Mississippi State's no easy place to win. The Bulldogs are almost always picked to finish last in the West during the Dan Mullen era. They almost never did that. So Mullen, from that standpoint, can say he's a pretty good game coach. But at Florida, the expectations are just far higher than that. You've got to be more than just a, hey, this guy gets the most out of his talent. You've got to actually compete at the highest level. And from that standpoint, and this is not like, Gator Hater BA taking a jab, to the extent that it's possible, this is my just earnest belief, that Mullen, as an offensive mind, does not actually rank among this sport's very best. I mean, there was this thing of, well, maybe Dan Mullen will go take the Dallas Cowboys job. He worked with Dak Prescott at Mississippi State. Maybe he'll go be the Cowboys coach. But do you really think of Mullen in the same category you think of Joe Brady? I don't. Do you think of Mullen in the same category you think of Ryan Day at Ohio State or Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma? I mean, we are in a collection, in a time in the sport now where truly innovative offensive minds are, like, they're incredibly dynamic. I think of Mullen as a good game coach. His time at Mississippi State probably proves that. But I don't think of him as one of these, like, oh my gosh, what is Dan Mullen going to draw up? It's going to be so difficult to defend. I mean, go back and think about the Rose Bowl against Lincoln Riley. I mean, think about all the time we spent here on DawgNation Daily talking about all the different things that Oklahoma might do in a game like that. You had to legitimately be on guard for anything. And I don't think that Dan Mullen strikes the same kind of fear in you, even though really, from a talent standpoint, they are very much on par. I just think that guys like Riley strike more fear in you. Even a guy like Cliff Kingsbury, who had lesser talent at Texas Tech, ended up losing his job there. When you see what he's become with the Arizona Cardinals, I think pretty good offensive mind. A guy that evolved a little bit over his rookie season as an NFL coach. I don't think of Mullen in that category either. So I think that Mullen wants to be the kind of, this is the mad scientist offensive mind. But in terms of the very best in the sport, I don't think he ranks there. And listen, if you Google best play caller in college football, I don't think Mullen belongs in that first page of search results. So in that case, he's just among the rest of the pack there at that point in time. Green Soldier says talking season has officially begun. Yeah, listen, we kind of usher in the talking season around here. Uncle Kev says talk about the defense more. Should be exciting. A lot of focus has been on the offense. I think one of the reasons why there's been so much focus on the offense is because that's where Georgia needs the biggest upgrade. It's where it needs the most improvement. However, there's justifiably some excitement on the defense. One of the things that does concern me a bit with the Georgia defense, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, even though on paper this group looks to be about as deep as any defense in college football is going to be, and will get a lot of preseason attention, a lot of pats on the back and praise coming into the start of the year. I think one of the things I would be a little bit concerned about is that when that defense, as good as it was in 2019, when it faced a really prolific offense like LSU's, it had a hard time keeping pace with that. And I think one of the things that I'd love to see the Georgia defense do from an evolutionary standpoint is I'd love to see this defense find a way to be more aggressive, not just limiting big plays, but really being more impactful in the backfield. I know, people are sort of tired of the havoc rate talk. We did that all spring and summer. I know that kind of got a little tiresome after a while. But admittedly, I think that is the next step for this Georgia defense. And with guys like Azeez Ojulari, another year older, Nolan Smith now going into a sophomore season, the emergence of Trayvon Walker, with guys like that, I do think a next step for this defense to take, if it's going to be as great in real life as it appears to be on paper, then you do need to get more sacks. You just do. You do need more tackles for loss. I mean, I've kind of always thrown that number around. I'd love to see this defense find a way to get 40 sacks. With the kind of talent that it has right now, the ability to kind of rotate those guys in and out. Adam Anderson, keep him involved in a conversation like that. I'd love to see this Georgia defense take that next step. And to be as great as some people are going to be expecting it to be, that to me would be an appropriate next step for it to take. Now, will it do that? Sometimes it seems like from a schematic standpoint, Kirby just prefers different things. But when you watch what teams like Clemson have done, Ohio State have done, sacking the quarterback is a big part of that college football playoff formula. So I'd love to see Georgia more involved in that. So that's kind of my early thought on the defense right now. Bulldog Freakzoid says, I don't see Georgia losing more than 2 games in 2020. Yeah, boy, hope not. It's kind of funny around here. The line between successful season and unsuccessful season is very, very thin. Very, very thin. Michael Del Monte says, are you happy you never have to play in the swamp? I think it's a very interesting question. Our buddy Connor has brought this up before, that Georgia is in control of the Georgia-Florida rivalry right now, that if you ever did switch it back to a home-and-home on campus, at least theoretically, the games become more difficult to win because now you've taken what is in a hostile stadium 0% of the time and put it into a hostile stadium 50% of the time. And I think it's an interesting take on that. Excuse me. Christopher White on the subject of Jared Zirkle. As we get closer to the start of the season, that is a guy that's going to get talked about a lot as a potential replacement for Rodrigo Blankenship, a name that folks will be really, really familiarizing themselves with once he shows up. Clinton Thrift says, BA, once Kirby got trust that we can man up in coverage, Kirby will bring the pressure. So we'll see if that ends up being true, Clinton. Ben Green says the heat they brought against Baylor was something serious. I think they will take the next step. These guys are a year older and more experienced. There will be more comfort in aggression. I like that phrase, comfort in aggression. That's pretty good. I believe we'll see some heat. Good comment, Ben. Appreciate that. Caleb McCourt says defense will be fine and has been, and our defensive staff is solid. Can't wait to see the Wake Forest kid at quarterback. Hoping Monken is going to bring back the toss and also throw a little bit more. Yeah, Caleb, I think all those things are very interesting and true. Phil Rogers says defense needs to get turnovers and cause sacks. And, that sack rate is one of the things that can certainly help influence turnovers a lot more. Ricky Jett says Nakobe Dean, Nolan Smith should be beasts. They really should be. James Crump kind of already thinking about some of those big names for the 2021 class. Fun to think about that. Christopher White also reminding us the offense didn't help the defense much in the SEC championship game. That's probably true. Graham Nicholson says, we talk with our helmets. That's the phrase that Kirby Smart made famous. So good comment. Good comment. Matt Turner says Mullen's Butch Jones 2.0. Yeah, that's always the thing you got to be careful of. When you have big talk and it kind of veers more in the direction of, like, say, corniness as opposed to like a rallying point, that ends up being, a little bit of a problem. And so Butch Jones will always be the cautionary tale when it comes to stuff like that. Nonetheless, we appreciate all of you being with us here today. By the way, I hope you'll check out the AJC at ajc.com for your Atlanta news now. Continue to be, tributes to Kobe Bryant you can read about there. Falcons getting ready for the NFL draft. You can kind of read about that too. Also, Kyle Shanahan, the coach of the 49ers Super Bowl coming up on Sunday in Miami, asked some questions about his time in Atlanta and his decision not to run the ball when Atlanta had the lead in the Super Bowl. One of the key decisions that I think led to the Falcons squandering of its 28-3 lead in that Super Bowl. Shanahan pressed on that a little bit more this week, kind of dodging those questions. You can read more about that. And just a whole lot more. Restaurant reviews, things like that. Just get your Atlanta news now. Check in throughout the day to stay up to date on everything that's going on. AJC.com for Atlanta news now. Also, our friends at R.S. Andrews make the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Story after story, R.S. Andrews has been delivering smiles. They can deliver smiles for you as well, but you can find them online at rsandrews.com. You have a great day. I will look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. for another edition of DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Have a great day, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.